Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. I'm Jack Tolbert, and today I'm in Edinburgh, and we're here to discuss the future of public affairs with my guest, Devin Scobie. Devin, welcome.
Good morning, Jack, and welcome to Scotland.
Oh, it's great to be here, as always, so thank you very much. In terms of the episode today, we are in Edinburgh. We are going to talk about Scotland. That is the focus of today's episode. So very, very excited to get the ball rolling with what public affairs looks like now, but also next in Scotland. So, Devin, in terms of your experience in politics and public affairs, there's obviously quite a lot in terms of what you've got your opinions to base on. If I read out a couple of notes for the audience and our listeners, you're a former Liberal Democrat councillor. You worked at Fleischmann, I should say. You've worked at Perceptive Communications, and you've been a freelancer for at least the last 5 years or so. So how's everything evolved in that time?
Well, politics is always a journey. I don't think you ever reach the end point in politics, and I don't think it takes a crystal ball to appreciate that we are in a very, very seismic period of time. The speed at which things are changing, the level of tolerance which people seem to have lost in politics is probably at an all-time high. And as somebody who started my active years in 1979 for the first Scottish Parliament referendum, or indeed the Assembly referendum as it was called, I would struggle to think of a time where there has been so much to play for, but so much uncertainty about who is going to do that and how it will be achieved.
We are going to get into a bit about that later, which I'm really looking forward to. In terms of how public affairs as a profession has evolved a little bit in your time, are you able to talk our listeners through what that's been for you?
I think the most obvious thing to say, and I think this applies to so many walks of life, is that it's got a lot faster. It's got a lot more immediate. All our lives are governed by these little black boxes of iPhones or other phones are available that we carry around in our pockets. And I just think politicians don't have the time they used to have. I first got actively involved in the public affairs world round about the Scotland Act of 1997. And when I started engaging on behalf of clients at the Scottish Parliament, it was a slower pace of time. You could still send an old-fashioned letter and get one back. You could still, for example, arrange a roundtable dinner and reasonably expect to get 6 or 7 MSPs there. Now you would struggle to get even one to give you more than 30 minutes of their time, unless there is something really exceptional or it's something of a particular interest to them. So I think the speed of change has been remarkable. I would also say, and again, it's a bit of a cliche that the policemen are getting younger, but there is no doubt that politicians are getting younger. A lot of candidates for next year's all-out elections are the same age or younger than my children. And that, although part of it makes me feel old, it also means that more and more people are coming into elected politics who have not had the hinterland of a business experience or a profession or worked in a family business or a trade. And I don't think that is entirely helpful for democracy. There are so many who read politics at university, who went on to become perhaps a special advisor or get elected as a councillor somewhere, or have worked for an MSP. And there is almost an established career path for so many young people. I mean, the last time we had a conversation, Jack, was on the backdrop of the SNP conference. And you can just see how many keen, young, ambitious people there are out there, a lot of whom will get into politics. And some might even get elected, might go into a ministerial career. I mean, I always look at John Swinney as an example of how to do it well. Now, this is not a partisan point. I was lucky enough to go to university with John and a few other well-known characters as well. But John in particular stands out because he is one of the nice guys in politics. And I don't use that term often about politicians, but he has slowly but steadily worked his way up. But he has built his career on having a business background to begin with. He did a lot of voluntary roles within the SNP. He had a little stint at Westminster, and he was one of the first intake in 1999. So he has got a more conventional path to the top, whereas you only need to look around the cabinet table now and you see people like Mary McCallan or Mary Goujon and a few others at a junior level who have essentially been full-time politicians from the day they left school.
The point there around, this is my words, not your words, but the point here around kind of the career politicians versus politicians that have a foundation of knowledge and experience, and whether that's in business or whether it's in maybe the medical, whatever profession it would be. It's something I want to spend a little bit of time discussing, because in our experience, one of the observations across the board, I'm talking Westminster as well as the devolved, is there is a challenge here with the type of person you're looking to engage with. And I have to be very diplomatic here. There's definitely a view that the career politicians that don't necessarily have any experience outside of trying to become a politician can sometimes, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a different type of challenge when you engage with someone versus maybe somebody, let's say, who is an MP, and let's say they specialize in health and they sit on a health committee, but they trained as a doctor and have 10 years experience as a doctor. That's kind of one of the things that we see a lot of and we hear a lot of professionally as well as personally, in all transparency. Are you able to talk a little bit about what that looks like in reality, or how that might have evolved?
Yes, I mean, I always like politics is a very interpersonal game. And I know, for example, when you engage with somebody like Dr. Sandesh Gilan, the Conservative lead on health matters, he is an NHS doctor. He draws heavily on his experience there, and that gives him real experience, but it also makes him a credible politician to speak about those issues. I would also touch on Dr. Zabir Ahmed, who is an NHS consultant surgeon, and although he's not at Holyrood, he did win a seat for Labour in Glasgow last year and is now a junior minister with a health portfolio. So it's that lived experience makes such a difference. Politicians who have had the experience of running their own business or actually even employing people are a lot closer to challenges like the impact of the national insurance changes. And albeit that's a reserved issue, it does play hard into the sort of issues that politicians at Holyrood are expected to engage on and to represent views on. And I know it's pretty near the top of lists that all MSPs and indeed MPs are still getting lobbied on. So yeah, that real world experience helps. I mean, in Holyrood, you've got former bus drivers, you've got former, like Tim Eagle is still a working farmer. There's a number of ex-journalists out there as well. Conservative leader Russell Finlay in Scotland won an award for a major report that he published before he was an MSP about bullying. He had acid thrown in his face and still uses that as a real experience of having worked in the real world. And I think we need more of them. Is politics attractive to people who've got a business or a career background? I don't think so anymore. I really don't. I know a lot of people in business who so many people have said, you would make a brilliant MSP, you know how it all works, but they wouldn't touch it with a barge pole.
Why is that?
I think because politics, especially now as we're going into 2026, an election year, has got a really, really toxic reputation at the moment. And I find that hard. I was fortunate to be elected as an Edinburgh City Councillor in my mid-20s, and biggest single thing that surprised me was how much business got transacted with a consensus view that all the parties would work together to get the best outcome for, in that case, the City of Edinburgh. And I think working on that sort of collegiate consensus approach, it is still there on some of the committees, but it is rarely there now in the Holyrood Chamber, and it's certainly far from most people's minds when they look at a rabble-rousing session at the Scottish Parliament. And it's similar to Prime Minister's questions at Westminster. People look at that through the prism of the TV news and they assume that's what it's like all the time. Well, it's not. But there is an underlying level of almost nastiness, I think, has crept into politics in Scotland. And I know I'm focusing very heavily in Scotland because that's the subject of today's interview. But I think politics in Scotland, for the first 20 or so years of devolution, I found was very fair. And now it's almost impossible to hold an opposing view. So you either share a view with someone or you're wrong in many, many people's eyes. And I don't think that's healthy. And the obvious consequence of that is that the people who elect politicians are just turned off by it. Now, this is going to be broadcast a good while before the 7th of May elections next year, but I will make a confident prediction that turnout next year will be the lowest ever for a Scottish parliamentary election. Holyrood elections tend to get a lower turnout anyway than, say, a Westminster election. And we'll never get anywhere near the 85% or thereabouts turnout we had for our 2014 independence referendum. But I think there'll be a lot of seats where we will struggle to see a 50% turnout of registered electors. And that is very sad for democracy. And it's not healthy for democracy either. Because when you translate that all down to how many actual people as a percentage of voters elected MSPX, or even added up to elect what will probably be the largest party that will form potentially a minority administration, it will not be a big number. And then it's a downward spiral because people will think, well, only a few thousand people at the end of the day literally elected that person who's now forming an administration. Is that a legitimate mandate?
It's a slippery slope. And I have my own opinions about kind of the state of politics and the confidence with it. But this discussion is not about me. And I'm very, very happy to have listened to what you said. I think on reflection that the best way or what you said around going back to how politicians with real life career experience are closer to challenges. I think that is the thing that definitely appears to be linked to credibility from most people's view within the ecosystem. So that is really good. And just for the benefit of the listeners, there may be a bit of background noise here. We are not in any studio by any stretch of the imagination. So apologies if you get a bit of background noise. We're going to move on in a few moments to a little bit about the contrast between public affairs in Scotland and Holyrood and public affairs in Westminster. Before we get to that, Devin, are there any other kind of bits you want to highlight or bring out into the discussion around how the profession's changed in the last few years here in Scotland?
I think, from my point of view, another trend that we didn't have 10 to 15 years ago is the phenomenon, and I'm sure somebody will invent a word for it, but politicians who have become consultants themselves. Every 4 or 5 years, I feel as though a tsunami hits my contact book, and so many people that I've built up relationships with, and on a few occasions, friendships as well, they just disappear. They retire, they stand down, which is fair enough, or they will lose their ranking on a list system, or they'll just, be defeated. And you need to start to build that all up again. But I also think we've lost a lot of personalities in politics. And I know we live in a democracy, it shouldn't always be about the personality, but there is no doubt at all that if the electorate know or recognise the names in the ballot paper or even in the campaign, the leaflets coming through the door, there's probably a higher chance they might actually bother to listen to what they're saying. I mean, I go back to when I started in 1999, you had big names like David Steele, Donald Dewar, even Henry McLeish. People knew who they were. They were coming into their living rooms nightly on TV before we were all obsessed with getting the news on our phones and social media. People would take the time to listen to what they were saying. I've always maintained that MSPs who've served any time at all on the green benches at Westminster are much, much more effective operators. It's almost like that is one level of political apprenticeship that I would wholeheartedly endorse. Now, in 1999, there was something like 21, 22 former or sitting MPs became MSPs. It's now well into single figures. We might see a few SNP former MPs elected next year. There might even be one or two incumbents. I know people like Stephen Flynn is talking actively about going for Holyrood, but you just don't have these big personalities that people can listen to with a sense of respect in the way I think they used to. And again, it's not healthy.
Absolutely. I think the health check on politics domestically here in the UK is quite well known for amongst our listeners. And you mentioned Westminster there, which is a really good segue. The context of the question I'm about to ask is predominantly, actually, selfishly for me, is my kind of background and experience is predominantly in Westminster and is in Brussels. You are obviously vastly experienced here in Scotland, and some of your experience we went through earlier, but you also have experience in Wales, in the Senedd. You also have experience across Westminster as well. Could you maybe outline for the beginner to politics here in Holyrood, kind of what is similar to politics in Westminster and what's different, and how do you see that?
Simple biggest difference between certainly the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd is that the process is simpler. The one advantage of having two relatively young institutions is that they were able to basically look at Westminster, strip out the things that worked, like having a robust committee system, but strip out all the things that didn't work, like long hours, long sittings, protocols that meant you had to jump up and down with a top hat, even right down to physically having a chamber that is big enough to give every MSP a seat. I mean, it is a nonsense that only 2/3 of MPs can literally get a seat in the chamber. And I know there were reasons why it was created like that, but that is crying out to be something that is just plain wrong, in my view. So yes, there are similarities, but it's a simpler system. All legislation goes through a single 3-stage process, and by and large, it's easy to follow. So if you're tracking a bill, whether as a professional consultant or whether you're just a corporate with an interest in a piece of legislation, it's a lot easier to both, from our point of view, advise clients, give them the correct points at which they should intervene, tell them the points where you're literally wasting energy if you're going too soon. Like, for example, when a bill is announced or having the effective equivalent of its first reading at stage 1 debate in Holyrood, that is not the time to be lobbying to try and get amendments in. But the stage 2 is a very robust committee system or committee in level of scrutiny. That is where you can get the real work done. That is where lobbying across all the parties can bear fruit. Because the other thing that people tend to forget is just how much consensus there is in some cases behind the scenes. It's not all about the shouting and yelling that you see at First Minister's questions. There is a level of consensus there. And I have many, many occasions where I've managed to get amendments through at the second stage of a bill that they're not partisan, they're not particularly controversial, they're just common sense, but they've been identified by either a charity or an outside interest or a trade or a professional body as something that would make the legislation better. And that's the sort of thing that politicians want to hear. It's not always about, well, give me some ammunition that I can win a point over an SNP minority administration. It's not always about that. In fact, it's very rarely about that. But it is about knowing the point at which to intervene. And it's a lot easier to do that the way Holyrood is set up. You've also got fewer personalities to know. You've 129 MSPs, and every one of them that's not a minister is pretty much compelled to sit on at least one committee. And there is a lot more consensus across the committee structures. They were always intended to be the scrutiny level within the Scottish Parliament in the same way the House of Lords now operates at Westminster, often in a very effective way. So it's a simpler process. There are easier points in which you can engage across the spectrum in the legislative process. And also, it makes targeting easier as well. Now, I think I've lasted as long as I have in the public affairs business, because I've tried hard not to be a pest. The worst thing you can do is hold an event at Scottish Parliament and then hound MSP staffers to say, oh, you're coming along, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. Or send out a briefing note, phone 24 hours later, did your boss get that? What did they think about it? Do they want to have a meeting in a few days' time? So just planning ahead, thinking ahead, and dare I say it, having a bit of a strategy, not going blind into something.
Very good, thank you. That definitely helps me, I must admit, and hopefully some of the listeners in terms of a very basic level understanding those core differences between Westminster and Holyrood. Devin, thank you. Let's move on ever so slightly and talk about technology, specifically artificial intelligence. So we've spoken to a lot of people on this podcast and outside the podcast. They've got some mixed views, but also some consistent views about AI. What's your view on what impact AI is going to have on public affairs up here in Scotland?
I think, Jack, it's one of these areas that no one really is ever going to understand it fully, far less its potential. However, it is already a fact of life that it's there. And my view is that it's a resource that can be harnessed. We'd probably already use it for giving us an up-to-date biography of an elected member. I think the short answer is that it will transform some of the more labour-intensive areas. Monitoring is the obvious one, but if you are working with, say, a large health sector client, health is more than a third of the budget of the Scottish Government, and if you had an AI search on everything around about health, you would be swamped within an hour about everything that's going through. In the past, I've worked with a number of pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer being the largest one for many years, and we had monitoring alerts set up across numerous disciplines, but every single month when we sent a detailed summary report, doing it the old-fashioned way, we were still picking up too much. So I would like to think that AI in 2026 is more sophisticated and can be fine-tuned to a better degree, but it will help with monitoring. It will help with getting to know some of the personalities better, at least in terms of the background. In time, it will probably help even drafting briefings, speech notes, and so forth. The sort of things that perhaps an account executive or a junior account manager would do in a larger agency environment. The one thing it will never do, and you're the only person today that can see the grey hair that I've got in my head, but I can assure you I didn't have grey hair when I started out in the public affairs business. But there is no substitute for, in my case, 25, 30 years of working experience. something like 450 people-ish have ever been elected to the Scottish Parliament. And I reckon I've probably met at least 350 plus of them over the years. You cannot take that level of experience away. You cannot invent that. You can get to know some pretty weird and wonderful things about people who are high profile as politicians, like what films they like, if they've ever had a half marathon, a medal around their neck. But what you will not get is what they're like to deal with face to face. Are they a private person? What level of briefing do they like in advance? Do you know their staffers? You cannot get to know the names of staffers, and a good staffer is worth their weight in gold because they are the gatekeeper to the politician's diary. And they also occasionally, as we spoke about earlier, have a habit of getting elected occasionally. A couple of election cycles ago, there was a Labour MSP who lost her seat, but her staffer was standing as a candidate in a seat, which of course no one ever thought they would win. And in the morning after the election, the MSP was unemployed, but the staffer had now won a seat. And big surprise, that ex-MSP ended up working for a former staffer, although I believe it didn't last long as a working relationship. So yes, in summary, it will take away a lot of the desk-based research tasks, but it will never be a substitute for that in-person knowledge. And Jack, as you know as well, this business is not about, well, I'll hire Devin because he knows these politicians even better than I ever will. And if I give him lots of money, that will increase my chances of getting known. That's not the way lobbying works anymore. But if you hire somebody that might have a bit of grey hair in their head, there's a fair chance they will have known someone who's now a minister since they were a junior MSP, perhaps even as a candidate or as a councillor in a local authority. Again, I know it's Westminster, but Ian Murray, I knew him when he was newly elected as a councillor. He shared an office with a councillor friend of mine. He went on to become quite a senior councillor. And then, of course, he ended up in the cabinet as Keir Starmer's first Secretary of State for Scotland, but also for 2 election cycles. He was the lone Labour MP in Scotland. But I don't see Ian often, but when I do bump into him, there is a certain connection there because he knows I've known him for many, many years, and I've seen him angst about little council details. I've seen him grow up through the ranks as a junior MP, then a cabinet minister, and now holding a couple of Minister of State level posts as well. So face-to-face contact will never be invented by a machine, or if they do, it'll be long after my time in this business.
I tend to agree. Thank you. We're going to move on because we've got a lot to cover. And one of the areas of the discussion I'm really, really wanting to explore with you is about the elections next year. So for the benefit of all the listeners, we're not even in mid-November, on the 10th of November here in Edinburgh. By the time this episode goes out, it's probably going to be January 2026. 2026 is going to be a big year when it comes to elections. They are big in isolation, but there is a bigger context here, potentially, depending on which way you look at it. When you look at the UK government as we are and where the polls are and where domestic politics here is in the UK. I've got 2 questions for you when it comes to the elections. My first question is, do you have a view on how things may or may not pan out? Obviously, we're a little bit ahead of time, but that would be the first thing to explore. And secondly, what kind of impact on public affairs professionals do you think the election could have next year?
Well, you like your short, snappy question.
Yeah.
I could probably fill an hour with both of those. The one thing I have learned over many years in this business is not to make predictions about election numbers. And even sometimes election trends can be quite deceptive as well. Now, the obvious answer that if you and I were sitting in a pub, we would probably come to is, yeah, reform's going to run away with the ball. They're going to be this shiny new force in Scottish politics, and the other parties are just going to fade away, or at least take a big thumping in the polls. I think the reality will be a little bit more complex than that. And without giving your listeners a lecture about the quirky D'Hondt system of proportional representation, in Scotland and indeed in Wales as well, voters will have 2 ballot papers. You'll have your traditional white one in 73 first past the post seats, which incidentally have newly drawn boundaries for next May, so that will add a little bit of interest to some seats. But you also have another 56 seats that will be voted in through a regional list system. You will rank parties, and you're effectively choosing the party. The parties themselves, by whatever means they've chosen, will select the candidates. So if you're the Liberal Democrats, for example, there's been open hustings, it's a member ballot, and the members decide the ranking. Other parties, and I know Reform, for example, are going to keep their cards close to their chest, and I think there'll be a lot more centralised interest in who tops the regional polls across the 7 regions of Scotland. Sorry, 8 regions of Scotland, doing my maths there. In terms of who the winners and losers will be, I would be very, very surprised if the SNP is not the largest party. And I also think it's not inconceivable they could win an outright majority again. I know that goes against every rule of Westminster politics where parties get 1 or 2 election cycles and then they're turfed out. It's happened to Labour, it's happened to the Conservatives back in July 2024. And heaven knows where the polls are when this has been broadcast, but on the 10th of November, it's not looking good for any of the major parties, particularly Labour and the Conservatives. So I think the SNP will be the largest party. If they do win 50% of the popular vote, which I think is unlikely, but I think it's more likely they could just get over the line and get 65 MSPs, that will undoubtedly increase the call for a second independence referendum. And I think that is the big sleeper that a lot of people in public affairs are not really talking about, because it was an extremely divisive time back in 2014. It was something which everybody had a view on, but of course, big corporates couldn't possibly express that. If we are on the cusp of another independence referendum, we will be doing that against the backdrop of a Brexit process that by anybody's definition has not worked out particularly well and has not delivered many, if indeed any, of the promises that I remember the Leave campaign championing so heavily. I think we will see a sharp decline in support for both Labour and the Conservatives as the 2 traditional ugly sisters of UK politics. I'm sorry that's the case. I think for the Conservatives, it's just a continuation of a trend that has been going on for many, many years. People with longer memories might remember Murdo Fraser, who's still an MSP, a former deputy leader of the Conservatives in Scotland. About 10 to 12 years ago, he had a failed leadership bid, and his big campaign tranche or big campaign promise was to effectively create a new version of the Conservative Party in Scotland. And I think with hindsight, that would have given the Conservatives a much greater bounce to help keep them active had that happened. He was unsuccessful, so the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party has rolled on. But the shadow that was cast by their thumping at last year's Westminster election undoubtedly is still there. The Conservatives elected 31 MSPs back in 2021. They've already lost 3 to defections, or one that's sitting as an independent. So that leaves 28. If they maintain double figures next year, I'll be surprised. And I know a few friends in politics who are in the Conservatives are fighting really, really hard to get that number 1 list post. In Lothian region, for example, they have 3 out of 7 regional MSPs. I think they'll struggle to keep 1. And there is a battle royal going on for that 1 place, just using 1 party in 1 region. I think the same's true in Labour. I think Anas Sarwar has been probably the most effective leader of Scottish Labour in the last 15 years. An experienced guy, a very able individual to do business with, and of course had 1 stint as an MP at Westminster as well, which gives him an extra degree of knowledge and experience. But he's going to be swept away with this tide of unpopularity that Keir Starmer and the Westminster government have got. We will know the full fallout from Rachel Reeves' November 2025 budget by the time this is broadcast. I don't think it's going to end well for either Rachel Reeves or the UK Labour Party, and that will undoubtedly hurt Anas Sarwar and his colleagues in Scotland. I think the smaller parties at Holyrood will see a little bit of an uptick in support. The Liberal Democrats have got 5 MSPs at the moment, which includes 1 defector from the Tories. I would be very surprised if they don't go into double figures. The Greens will probably get a bit of a bounce through the regional vote, and all the smaller parties are really working very hard for that second ballot I referred to. I will touch on Reform in a moment, but a bit of a sleeper that people are not really paying much attention to is the Your Party campaign. The party that still doesn't have a name, but Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana have both been quietly building up a network of contacts. They had a defection of 3 Green councillors in Glasgow a few weeks ago, and I think that is just the start. I think Your Party will scrape a lot of votes off the regional list, particularly in the West Coast, particularly in Glasgow, where people have gone from Labour to the SNP, and I know a lot of people are now disenchanted with the SNP, arguing that they failed to deliver on education, the health service, of course, even transport, infrastructure links, all things that have been devolved for a generation to Scotland. And most of that time has been under the helm of an SNP-led administration. So I think there will be an appeal from further left on the spectrum. And undoubtedly, Reform are going to do well in Scotland. I have a hunch they're not going to do quite as well as they think they will. And I may well come back to Rulo's words. But it's going to be a very crowded market in Scotland. And in Glasgow alone, the gift that keeps on giving, that is George Galloway, he's going to be back. He's going to be standing as George Galloway. In Glasgow again, where famously he was an MP back in Hillhead in the early 80s, he could well end up as an MSP. And one George Galloway is worth a dozen politicians in anybody's party in terms of airtime and volume. So it's going to be a fascinating election. And the stampede to get over the line for those 7 seats across the 8 regions is going to be one of the hardest fought battles in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you have a couple of moments there to maybe take a sip of water, because you've talked really, really well through a number of things. And I think you're absolutely right. We're on the 10th of November here. We haven't even had the budget, which is due in, I want to say, 2.5 weeks' time or so. The overall picture doesn't look great for the Labour Party. And there is, or I was reading on the weekend, some articles around the movement of the Parliamentary Labour Party and what they're doing behind the scenes. So we'll wait and see, and it'll be interesting to see where we are in January when this episode goes live in the public domain as to where we are. Just in terms of the profession, the public affairs profession here in Scotland, obviously you've mentioned potentially a second referendum. You've mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, etc. Are there any other major points of thinking or consideration at all, would you say, for the profession in relation to the elections next year?
I think for the public affairs profession, and it is a well-established profession in Scotland, it will never be anything like as large as the environment in Westminster or indeed in Brussels. But there is a good network of public affairs professionals in Scotland. I think one of the key things will be to make sure we're across all the bases in terms of how this kaleidoscope of parties is going to fit together. None of us know how that is going to work out. There are multiple talks about various deals that could work. There could be a Labour SNP deal to keep Reform out. I've heard one Conservative MSP suggest a pro-union alliance between Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems. I don't think they'll get the numbers for that even to be on the cards. It's a bit like in 2010, there just wasn't the numbers to get the coalition together, hence why you ended up with a Conservative Lib Dem administration at Westminster. What I would say is we're going to have to be super hard at putting in the groundwork before May to make sure we are covering contacts across all the parties. And I've lost count of the number of times I've been asked by clients, by colleagues, even by incumbent MSPs, what on earth we're going to do about Reform. It is this massive big, it's like a scene from the Indiana Jones film where this enormous big ball comes rolling down the tunnel in the cave. We all know it's coming. We all know this huge big thing is called Reform at the Scottish Parliament is coming, but it doesn't have much of an identity. I think Nigel Farage is such an enormous figurehead for Reform in the UK, and clearly is a huge draw for many potential Reform voters. But Reform are going to have to be careful. They're going to have to make sure that they get some credible Scottish identity out there. They will need to have a leader when they go into an election campaign. However hard they might try to organise a list rankings and present themselves as a new party, not just a reinvented Conservative party, they will need a leader. Somebody will need to be standing up in debates prior to the campaign concluding. Somebody will need to be ready to ask questions to whoever is First Minister. And who knows, it could even be a scenario, as we're talking about in Wales as well. It is possible Reform could even be the largest party. Now, I don't think that will happen, but they will need to have a First Minister in waiting. So I think my simple advice to any public affairs colleagues listening to this is make sure your proverbial little black book is up to date. And if you don't have them already, just make those contacts across all the parties and do not rely on existing contacts as being relevant going forward. And I would include your party in that as well, because, as I said earlier, I think there's a real chance that they will pick up 1 or 2 list seats. There will be a presence there. And I know from experience of having to deal with personalities like Tommy Sheridan and the Scottish Socialists, they hated any form of commercial lobbying at all. They didn't turn up at the usual Wednesday night drinks receptions in the Garden Lobby in Holyrood. They would not, even if they had representation on, say, the economy or the transport or the health committee, their MSPs would very, very seldom agree to meet with you. And I think that's going to be the same for some more left-leaning MSPs that come in next year. And the Greens are a little bit like that at the moment. I mean, the Greens are not an easy party to engage with at a corporate level, even if you're doing that on behalf of a not-for-profit trade body or something that's not really in any way partisan. Like I do a lot in building safety, I do a lot in rail infrastructure. Neither of those are remotely partisan, but we do need to get across all the parties that may have a view on it, across all the committees. And as I know from decades of experience, if you get to know people on the way up, then there will be much stronger contacts when they're in a position of influence. If you wait until Reform has, say, got 12, 15 MSPs, you will be at the end of a very long queue of people that want to get to know them.
Very long. And the old saying, the horse will definitely have bolted by that point. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to finish with a few slightly lighter questions. The first one, maybe not so light, but the question is, what would be your one non-negotiable piece of advice for someone starting out in public affairs in Scotland?
Do not rule out the value of building up contacts in non-government parties. People always assume that, and by people I mean prospective clients, whether they're small charities or global multinationals, if they get that elusive meeting with the minister, that is the pinnacle of influence. And yes, there are occasions, and I would always encourage any client to have an open door to ministers, but do not rule out the impact that backbenchers can have as a lobbying force within parliamentary groups, and certainly across all the parties on committees, because the committees were set up to be the scrutiny body for legislation. It is the easiest place to get amendments through in legislation. And if you have got those contacts across the board, it'll be a lot easier to at least make sure that the position that you're representing on behalf of your client is heard, it is acknowledged. Clearly, it'll ultimately be up to the politicians about whether they accept that as the correct way forward and make that happen in terms of legislative change, which is ultimately what it's all about. And it's the oldest cliche in the world, but the broader your contact book is, the better it is. I've been at this game for so long now that, and being a Lib Dem, I've always had a bit of a sympathy vote as well. So I make no bones about my personal politics, but I've always made sure I have got a good in to all the parties at senior and junior level as well. And that's the simple, most effective thing you can do. Just build up that network of contacts. Yeah, keep an eye on the people that impress you, because if they impress you as a public affairs professional, there's a pretty good chance they'll impress the party leader, who might reward them with a more senior spokespersonship or even a junior ministerial role going forward. And there will be a lot of change.
Yeah.
I mean, already we're seeing it's nearly a third of the parliament is going to stand down, retire, and obviously there will be casualties as well. I mean, of the 28 remaining Conservative MSPs, I would imagine the high teens of that number will be trying very hard to get a winnable seat next time round, and more than half of them will not succeed. And again, you're also seeing a churn as well with, I think there's something like 12 ex-SNP MPs are trying very hard to get nominations for Holyrood. So if you've got these contacts from Westminster days, then use them, make sure you're known. And just the last point I will make, but don't forget the value of organising a hustings meeting. I've got at least 3 I'm in the process of trying to organise at the moment, but that is one of the best ways to get to know an up-and-coming politician well. It's just to have a couple of hours of their time at a hustings meeting, plus all the pre-briefings that go with it. And obviously the nature of a hustings is it will cover all 6 main parties that we're probably going to have to think about now.
Yeah, thank you very much. The next question is, or maybe if I start before I ask the question, I imagine in your experience you've been to a number of party conferences, whether in Westminster or around the UK. But what would be your favourite experience or your best story from a conference up here in Scotland?
Yeah, you're right. I have been going to party conferences. I think the very first one I was at was the 1986 SDP UK conference, which was, of course, somewhere completely inaccessible from Edinburgh, down in the south coast of England. And there was four of us drove overnight in an old battered Renault 4 to sleep in blow-up airbeds in somebody's living room. But that was my first experience. The thought that came into my head when you asked me that question was with a very young, newly elected SNP, MSP, coming into a fringe meeting at the Caird Hall in Dundee to speak with a pharmaceutical client and literally been revolted at the sight of a bucket of coleslaw that had just been plonked down beside the open rolls. That was catering done Dundee style round about 1999, 2000. We shared a common bonding moment over what we're quite meant to do with this. It literally was an industrial sized tub of coleslaw and a wooden spoon. So I'm not quite sure what we were meant to do with it. However, that young MSP was the Shadow Health spokesperson for the SNP, and she was called Nicola Sturgeon. And I believe that she went on to do rather more important things. But it does emphasise my point about building up those contacts at an early opportunity, because some of them will crash and burn, some of them will serve one term, but some of them will go on to become very successful. And I mean that in the literal sense, not making a party point, but they will be very successful politicians within their own party.
A very good segue to the next question, which is, who would be your favourite First Minister?
I was in Cardiff a few weeks ago and I sat next to this student who was on his way to meet a lawyer to discuss an immigration problem. And he was obsessed about Michael Jackson. And he said, despite the fact that Michael Jackson's been dead for 16 years or so, he should posthumously be made president of America. And he was clearly very obsessed about this. Now, whilst I wouldn't advocate for a return of somebody like Michael Jackson, if he was even in a position to do so, it's a very hard question, because somebody who I might respect in a different walk of life, like perhaps a younger David Attenborough or a younger business leader like Richard Branson, I just think they would be so bored in the cut and thrust of politics. Somebody like Alan Sugar would be an interesting character to be First Minister. I would definitely need to be somebody who didn't have a toxic personality like so many politicians have, who had something that the public could engage with. Because in many ways, politicians that do well are the ones that are able to unlock parts of the electorate that either don't vote or have been put off the experience of voting. And regardless of where you sit on the Donald Trump fan club side of things, Donald Trump won in 2016 by getting people in states that hadn't voted for a long time or indeed ever to actually turn out. And he concentrated on those voters that were put off engaging with the democratic process. So I know I'm kind of slightly avoiding giving you a name, but I think it would need to be somebody who was a big enough personality in their own right to command a level of respect that would encourage people to turn up and vote. And again, I was never a particular fan or admirer of Alex Salmond, but he absolutely had the secret sauce of being a 5-star personality. And I know ultimately he probably did believe a bit more of his own ego that was healthy for democracy. But when he was at his heyday, and I spent a lot of time with him behind the scenes in client events, corporate events, and all the rest of it, he was an incredible networker. My God, he could work a room. I've never, like in a way, people, I've never done that before or since. So you need somebody that can just capture the imagination of the public and think, yeah, politics matters. It's about me. And those 129 folk at the Scottish Parliament, they are going to impact my life. So perhaps I should choose to engage with the process.
Very good. And the final question, which is definitely a nod towards the future, but is still along the lines of the First Minister. Is there a name out there who you think at some point in the future will be the First Minister? Not necessarily the next First Minister, but will be the First Minister at some stage.
Yeah, a bit in a way that, like, I mean, I was born and grew up in the pre-internet era, as my 26-year-old son never tires of reminding me. I have a feeling the next First Minister probably isn't yet an MSP. If my hunch is right and the SNP are the largest party, John Swinney will have a mandate of his own. I would be very surprised if he does a full 5 years as First Minister, because he will rightly want to protect his legacy. And I think his choice of the next Deputy First Minister will be quite a key one. Well, it will have to be. So I think whoever he chooses, if he is First Minister again after May the 7th next year, will be absolutely critical. There are very impressive young women in Scottish politics at the moment. Mary Goojal, Mary McCallan, two that come to mind. Jenny Gilruth as well. I worked with Jenny when she was Transport Minister quite closely. There's a really good undercurrent of young, successful women in Scottish politics, and I'm hugely encouraged by that. But I just have a feeling that the next First Minister is not yet an MSP.
It's a very, very interesting theory. And I think Mary McCallan, was definitely the name that I heard the most when we saw each other a few weeks ago in Aberdeen. So one for us to keep a watching brief on. So Devin, thank you so much for joining me here at Edinburgh on today's episode. It's been really, really good. Thank you. And my thanks as always to Ollie Foster, our in-house producer. Perhaps you have a view on the future of public affairs or the public affairs in Scotland and you'd like to share, or you'd like to contribute to the discussion yourself. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of de Havilland and Forefront.